somewhere within reach of your kitchen stove sits a container of salt that cost less than $2, and you have never once thought of it as an instrument of power. But in 1862, in the markets of Savannah, Georgia, a single sack of salt sold for as much as $60, which was more than a Confederate private earned in 5 months of soldiering. Roads were cut through mountains to reach it. A state government taxed it to dig a canal that redrew the map of American commerce. And during the Civil War, both armies marched hundreds of miles out of their way to burn the places where it was made. Here is the detail that almost nobody remembers. The first great industrial monopoly in American history was not oil. It was not steel, and it was not the railroads. It was salt, organized in a river valley in western Virginia in 1817, 65 years before John D. Rockefeller signed the agreement that created the Standard Oil Trust. The men who built that first cartel used a playbook so effective that you can trace its fingerprints on every monopoly that came after it. And they built it around a mineral you now shake onto your eggs without a second thought. Over the next half hour, I am going to walk you through how salt built American fortunes, how it broke them, and why the pattern it established still governs the way money concentrates in this country. Along the way, you will meet two brothers who drilled the first deep well in American history using a hollowed-out sycamore tree, a Louisiana island whose salt accidentally pointed drillers toward the biggest oil strike the world had ever seen, and a marketing decision from 1914 involving a little girl with an umbrella that turned a 2-cent commodity into a fortune that still exists today. And there is one more thing. The same invisible force that built every single salt fortune in this story also destroyed every single one of them. I will name that force before we are through, because once you can see it, you will start seeing it everywhere. Here is exactly what this episode will deliver. First, the story of David and Joseph Ruffner, who in 1808 punched through 58 feet of rock and mud in the Kanawha Valley chasing brine, and in doing so, invented the drilling techniques the oil industry would later borrow wholesale. Second, the 1817 agreement among the Kanawha salt makers that historians widely describe as America's first trust, with production quotas and pooled sales decades before anyone had a word for it. Third, why salt became so scarce in the Confederacy that a sack cost more than a rifle, and the story of the small Virginia town that both armies bled over twice in 3 months. Fourth, how a salt island in Louisiana, discovered by accident in May of 1862, ended up producing the most famous hot sauce in America and taught geologists a lesson that unlocked the Texas oil boom. And fifth, the two decisions made in 1914 and 1924, one about marketing and one about public health, that put salt's hidden ledger directly into your body and your kitchen, where it remains today. A note on method before we begin. This channel works from the primary record, from state tax ledgers, court filings, company charters, and the reports of the U.S. Geological Survey, because the story of American money is almost never written in the histories. It is written in the paperwork. Salt left a long paper trail. Let's follow it. The story starts with a spring. In the 1790s, in the valley of the Kanawha River in what was then Western Virginia, there was a patch of ground near present-day Malden where the earth leaked salty water. Animals had known about it for thousands of years. Buffalo wore trails through the Appalachian ridges to reach the salt licks, and those trails became the paths that hunters followed, and those paths became roads, which is a sentence worth pausing on. Some of the earliest routes into the American interior were not surveyed by engineers. They were surveyed by animals looking for salt. A farmer named Joseph Ruffner acquired the land around the spring in 1794, and when he died, it passed to his sons David and Joseph. The brothers understood something that seems obvious now but was not obvious then. The weak, muddy brine seeping at the surface had to be coming from somewhere stronger below. So beginning in 1806, they did something no American had done. They tried to drill for it. They took a hollowed-out sycamore trunk, roughly 4 feet across, stood it upright over the spring, and had men climb inside it to dig, lowering the tube as they went to hold back the mud and water. When they hit bedrock at around 17 feet, they rigged a long iron bit to a spring pole and began pounding through solid rock, inches per day, month after month. It took about 18 months. In January of 1808, at a depth of roughly 58 feet, they struck brine strong enough to be worth boiling, and shortly after, they cased the well with 2 wooden tubes to seal out the weak surface water. Almost every technique in that sentence, the drive pipe, the percussion bit, the well casing, would be borrowed, refined, and made famous by oil drillers half a century later. The Ruffners were drilling for salt, but they were inventing the American extraction industry. What followed was a boom. Within a decade, dozens of furnaces lined a stretch of the Kanawha River that came to be called the Salines, boiling brine day and night over coal fires, and by the 1840s the valley was producing millions of bushels of salt a year, much of it shipped downriver to Cincinnati, where it cured the pork that fed the country and earned that city the nickname Porkopolis. And it is important to say plainly what powered those furnaces. The Kanawha salt industry ran substantially on the labor of enslaved people, thousands of them over the decades, leased from Virginia plantations to chop wood, mine coal, and tend boiling kettles in some of the harshest industrial conditions on the continent. The fortunes made in that valley were built on their backs, and the ledgers record their higher prices with the same cold precision they record the price of kettles. Then, in November of 1817, the salt makers of the valley did something new. Facing falling prices from their own overproduction, the leading producers signed an agreement creating the Kanawha Salt Company, a combination that assigned each member a production quota, pooled the salt for sale through a single agent, and punished anyone who made too much. Historians widely describe it as the first trust in American history. It was cartel logic, fully formed 65 years before Standard Oil. And the reason I am telling you about a handful of furnace owners on a Virginia river is not because they were unusual. It is because the machine they built, scarcity plus geography plus organization, is the machine that has manufactured almost every great American fortune since. So let's take the machine apart, because the mechanism is simple enough to explain at a dinner table and strange enough that almost nobody does. Start with the demand side. Before mechanical refrigeration, which did not reach ordinary American households until the 20th century, salt was not a flavoring. It was the national food preservation system. Every barrel of pork, every side of bacon, every keg of fish that moved from farm to city moved because salt kept it from rotting. A single farm family might use 40 or 50 pounds a year just for curing, which means that whoever controlled salt did not merely control a condiment. They controlled the ability of food to travel, and therefore the ability of cities to exist. Now the supply side. Salt is one of the cheapest substances on earth to produce, but in the early republic it was brutally expensive to move. Hauling a barrel of anything over the Appalachians by wagon could multiply its price several times over. That transportation cost acted like a wall, and inside the wall, whoever owned the local salt source owned a captive market. Geography did the monopolizing. The owners just collected. Governments understood this perfectly, and here is the part of the story that even most history enthusiasts have never heard. The state of New York owned the salt springs at Onondaga, near present-day Syracuse, and in 1817, the legislature placed a duty of 12.5 cents on every bushel produced there, dedicating the revenue to a canal project most of the country considered a fantasy. That project was the Erie Canal, and salt money helped carry it, which is why people at the time called it the ditch that salt built. Syracuse became the salt city, boiling and sun-drying brine on such a scale that its salt reached the entire Great Lakes basin. The word salary, by long tradition, traces back to the Latin salarium, the allowance paid to Roman soldiers in connection with salt. And while scholars still argue about the details of that etymology, the underlying truth stands. Across most of recorded history, salt has functioned as money, as tax base, and as leverage. But notice what the Erie Canal actually did, because this is where the invisible force enters the story. The canal collapsed the cost of moving heavy goods by roughly 90%. And the moment moving salt became cheap, the wall around every local salt monopoly came down. Syracuse salt flooded west and undercut local producers. And then, within a few decades, cheaper salt from Michigan and Ohio and imported salt from Liverpool came flooding back east and undercut Syracuse. The canal that salt built destroyed the salt fortune that built it. The Kanawha cartel met the same fate. Railroads and river steamers brought outside salt into its captive markets. Its quotas could not hold, and by the 1870s, the valley that had been the salt capital of America was fading into a footnote. Remember David Ruffner pounding through bedrock with an iron bit? The well worked exactly as designed. The cartel worked exactly as designed. And none of it survived contact with cheap transportation, which is the force I promised to name. Every salt fortune in American history was a bet that distance would stay expensive. Every one of those bets eventually lost. But before the bets lost, they reshaped the country, and nowhere more violently than in the Civil War. Consider Saltville, a small town in the mountains of southwest Virginia, sitting on brine deposits so rich that when the war began, it became the primary salt source for nearly the entire Confederacy. The Union Navy's blockade had cut off imported salt almost immediately, and the results showed up in the price ledgers with terrifying speed. Salt that sold for around $1 or $1.25 a sack before the war reached $20.40. In some markets, $60 by late 1862. State governors began rationing it. Georgia distributed salt to soldiers' families as a welfare measure. Without it, armies could not preserve meat, farmers could not cure their hogs in November, and leather could not be tanned for boots and harnesses. Salt was not a comfort, it was logistics, which is why in October of 1864, a Union force of several thousand men rode into the mountains with orders to destroy the Saltville works. The First Battle of Saltville on October 2nd failed, and it is remembered today for what happened after the fighting stopped when Confederate soldiers and irregulars murdered wounded black troopers of the 5th U.S. Colored Cavalry, where they lay. The historical record of that massacre, assembled from soldiers' accounts and later investigations, is one of the darkest documents of the war. And it happened because of salt. 2 months later, in December, General George Stoneman's raiders came back, took the town, and spent 2 days wrecking the kettles, sheds, and wells. The Confederacy's food preservation system never recovered. Now moved 600 miles southwest to a low green island rising out of the Louisiana marsh. In May of 1862, workers on the Avery family's plantation, deepening an old brine spring to meet wartime demand, struck something no one in North America had ever commercially mined before: solid rock salt, nearly pure, just a few feet below the surface. Avery Island turned out to be the exposed cap of an enormous salt dome, a column of salt pushed up from thousands of feet below, and for about a year it supplied the Confederacy until Union troops landed in April of 1863 and destroyed the works. After the war, a man named Edmund McIlhenny, who had married into the Avery family, began experimenting on that same island with crushed peppers aged in salt from the family mine, and in 1868 he began selling the result, which the world now knows as Tabasco sauce. But the island's larger legacy was geological. Salt domes geologists slowly realized trap oil and gas around their flanks, and in 1901, drillers acting on exactly that logic bored into a salt dome called Spindletop near Beaumont, Texas, and hit a gusher that by contemporary estimates flowed on the order of 100,000 barrels a day, the strike that launched the Texas oil industry. The salt did not just precede American oil, it literally marked the spot. And for the third example, come north to Chicago. At the turn of the 20th century, the salt industry, by then a brutal commodity business, had tried the old cartel trick one more time. A combination called the National Salt Company, formed in 1899, attempted to corner the market, and it collapsed into receivership within about 3 years because by 1900 there was simply too much salt and too many railroads for scarcity to be manufactured. A distributor named Joy Morton, whose father had founded Arbor Day, drew the correct conclusion: if you cannot monopolize the mineral, monopolize the meaning. In 1910, he consolidated his interests as the Morton Salt Company, and in 1911 the company began adding magnesium carbonate to keep salt pouring freely in humid weather. Then in 1914 came the decision that separated Morton from every other bag of identical white crystals in America. A blue package, a little girl in the rain holding an umbrella, salt streaming from the canister under her arm, and the slogan, "When it rains, it pours." Morton was not selling sodium chloride anymore. It was selling reliability, and it worked so completely that the company still dominates American grocery shelves more than a century later. 3 stories, 1 pattern. When salt was scarce, men fought over geography. When salt became abundant, the fortune moved to whoever controlled the story. Which brings us to the ledger as it stands today, because salt's hidden entries never closed. They just changed columns, and I want to walk you through 5 of them in order of how directly they touch you. Entry 1 is inside your body right now. In the early 20th century, the Great Lakes region and inland Northwest were known to doctors as the goiter belt because iodine-deficient soil left huge numbers of people. By some Michigan surveys, a majority of children in certain counties with swollen thyroid glands. A Michigan pediatrician named David Murray Cowie championed a solution borrowed from Switzerland. Add a trace of iodine to table salt, and in 1924 iodized salt went on sale in Michigan and then nationally. Goiter rates collapsed within a generation. It is arguably the cheapest successful public health intervention in American history, and it worked precisely because salt was the one product every single household bought. The monopoly infrastructure of the 19th century became the medicine delivery system of the 20th. Entry 2 is under your tires. Per the U.S. Geological Survey, roughly 40% of all salt consumed in the United States in a typical year goes not into food but onto roads as de-icer. Tens of millions of tons in a hard winter, which means the largest salt customer in America is winter itself. Entry 3 is under a major American city. 1,200 feet beneath the streets of Detroit lies a working salt mine with a road network stretching on the order of 100 miles, carved through a salt bed laid down by an evaporating sea some 400 million years ago. Commuters drive over it every day without knowing it exists. Entry 4 is a warning about what happens below. In March of 1994, the Retzoff mine in western New York, then the largest salt mine in North America, suffered a roof collapse that let groundwater pour in. Within about 2 years, the entire mine, a century of excavation, was flooded and lost, and the land above subsided, cracking foundations and opening sinkholes. The salt economy is mostly invisible, and Retzoff is what it looks like when the invisible fails. Entry 5 is the playbook itself. Read the 1817 Kanawha Agreement with its member quotas, its single sales agent, its penalties for overproduction, and then read a description of how the OPECC oil cartel manages output today. The structure is nearly identical. The men on the Kanawha did not just make salt. They wrote the template for how producers everywhere would try to defeat competition, and American antitrust law is, in a real sense, a 200-year argument with that template. And there is one more entry, the one almost nobody knows, and it may be my favorite fact in this entire story. When the federal government decided, after the 1970s oil shocks, that the nation needed an emergency stockpile of crude oil, it faced a problem. Where do you safely keep hundreds of millions of barrels? Steel tanks leak, corrode, and burn. The answer the government chose was salt. The U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve, the SPR, stores its oil with an authorized capacity in the range of 700 million barrels inside enormous caverns hollowed out of Gulf Coast salt domes in Texas and Louisiana, the same geological formations that gave us Avery Island and Spindletop. Engineers create the caverns by pumping in water and dissolving the salt, and the salt that remains is self-sealing, essentially impermeable and geologically stable, which makes it close to the perfect vault. Salt built the American food system, then it built the oil industry by marking where to drill, and now it physically holds the nation's emergency energy supply in its arms. The mineral never left the center of American power, it just went underground. And it does not only hold oil. 650 feet below Hutchinson, Kansas, companies store original film reels and sensitive records in worked-out salt caverns because salt keeps the air dry and the temperature constant forever. Some of Hollywood's irreplaceable originals are resting at this moment in salt. So come back to your kitchen and look at that container one more time. $2 more or less. But now you know what you are actually holding. You are holding the commodity that carved the first roads through the Appalachians, that financed the Erie Canal, that powered America's first cartel on the backs of enslaved workers, that starved the Confederacy when it ran short, that pointed drillers to Spindletop, that cured a national epidemic for a fraction of a cent per meal, and that now guards the country's emergency oil inside its own crystal walls. The price on the shelf is not the value. It never was. The story of salt is the story of how American fortunes actually work. Find something everyone needs, stand between them and it while distance is still expensive, and organize before your competitors do. And when the wall of distance falls, as it always falls, the fortune passes to whoever controls the meaning instead of the mineral. That pattern did not retire with the salt barons. It is running right now, in industries you use every day, and on this channel we keep pulling almost threads, one everyday institution at a time. If this changed the way you look at the most ordinary object in your kitchen, subscribe so the next hidden ledger finds you, and leave a like so it finds someone else too. I will see you in the next one.